Is the Rwanda bill tough enough? Is renting second-rate? And Brexit 4 years on? This is Politics Live. Joining me, Conservative Deputy Chair for Women, Rachel Maclean, Labour MP Ben Bradshaw, Ollie Dugmore of Politics Jo, and The Spectator's Kate Andrews. Today, the government defends its flagship Rwanda bill.
There are very strong feelings about this whole legislation, and that's understandable because we all passionately in the Conservative Party want to deliver a deterrent that's going to stop the votes.
But rebel Tory MPs say it's not tough enough.
People want us to act finally and decisively on issues about immigration that have worried people for a long time.
Landlordism, it's the redistribution of income. It is the transfer of wealth from the wage class to the asset class.
Is there something intrinsically wrong about renting?
This is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama.
3, 2, 1...
Brexit 4 years on.
And what does Horizon say?
It says I've taken £2,032.67 more than I think I have.
And after the post office scandal, should the IT firm responsible get any more government contracts? Well, let's start with that story, the Post Office, that we covered last week so fully, because the bosses of the Post Office and Fujitsu, the software company, are in front of the Business Select Committee. They've been there most of the morning. They're being quizzed about their role in the scandal that resulted in so many sub-postmasters and mistresses wrongly being sent to prison. Let's just have a listen to the excerpt where the chair of the Select Committee is quizzing Paul Patterson, who is from Fujitsu.
Do you accept that Fujitsu evidence was used to put innocent people in prison?
Yes, there was evidence from us. We did have we were supporting rather the Post Office in their prosecutions. There was data given from us to them to support those prosecutions, so yes.
You've not made any provision in those accounts for a contribution to the compensation, but you're telling the committee today that you believe there is at least a moral obligation for Fujitsu to contribute.
Yes, I believe there is a moral obligation, and I've already said that. I think it's also important that the inquiry deals with these very complex matters with all the parties involved.
Well, pretty candid there from Paul Patterson, and in fact that Select Committee is continuing with questions throughout the day. You can see the live pictures here. My opening question, though, to the panel is, in the meantime, should Fujitsu continue to be awarded UK government contracts, Rachel?
Clearly not. I mean, clearly there is a huge amount of legal work that has to go on. These are complex issues. But from my perspective, they are clearly at fault, as you've heard from the committee. And I'm sure the government are looking at that. But there are huge questions and red flags that have been raised there.
Right. Do you agree? Because they certainly are in line for more government contracts, because they are one of the... I mean, the terminology is they're one of the key suppliers, if not a preferred bidder, but they're one of the key suppliers of software for government contracts.
Well, I certainly think that Rachel's right, that this should be stopped and looked at very carefully. And I think further than that, following that extraordinary admission, I think the government should look and take legal advice as to whether it can pursue Fujitsu for the costs of the compensation, because otherwise these costs are going to fall on the taxpayer.
Ollie?
I think it's 150 contracts since 2019 awarded to Fujitsu. I mean, we've known about this scandal since 2009 when Computer Weekly started reporting on it. And frankly, it beggars belief that it's taken an ITV drama to make people consider the procurement process in government and think that perhaps we should be doing things differently.
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, whichever sort of timescale you use, Fujitsu has won 101 new contracts worth just over £2 billion since the initial legal ruling. So should there now be a full stop on Fujitsu being awarded any further government contracts or not?
Yes, when virtually any other company is in a position to provide this rather than Fujitsu, that should be the preference. I think that Financial Times has done some amazing reporting around this, that if you go back to the coalition government, they were trying to break off contracts with Fujitsu, not around the Horizon software specifically, but because other contracts were going badly and there were other issues with software. I think we have to look at the whole procurement process in its entirety, because government lawyers, according to the FT, said at the time, we can't actually base this contract based on past performance. What kind of system do we have if you can't pick a company based on its past performance? That is such a bad deal for the taxpayer.
Do you feel guilty in any way? I mean, not directly for what's happened, but do you feel guilty about what has unfolded? And now when we look back historically, I mean, I think it was under Blair's government initially that the contract was granted because it was deemed important for UK-Japanese relations. And then, obviously, much more recently, since 2010, that despite evidence that came to the fore, really very little was done, Rachel.
I mean, I think all political parties and all politicians and all members of parliament have recognised and acknowledged that there have been failures that have gone back many, many years. And all of us have had cases of postmistresses and postmasters in our constituencies, and we've seen the human cost. So, yes, absolutely. And I think you've heard this from the Prime Minister. He's been very clear that this is wrong and he's going to take action to address it and put it right now.
All right. I mean, sorry, go on.
Just very briefly, it's very interesting that the head of the National Audit Office today, again in the Financial Times, saying that the way we procure IT contracts is not fit for purpose and we waste a lot of taxpayers' money and we don't get good delivery.
Do you think it'll actually change anything?
Well, I think this is something that whether this government has got time to in its last few months in office, or we, when we get into office, hopefully, are going to have to look at very carefully.
All right. Well, let's talk about the Rwanda bill, the government's emergency legislation. It's back in the House of Commons today for 2 days of scrutiny and amendments and debate from rebel Conservative MPs and others. Now, some of those signing the rebel amendments include 2 deputy chairs of the Conservative Party. In fact, they've tweeted that they have done so or are going to do so over the past 24 hours. Let's see Brendan Clark-Smith, first of all, tweeting, "When I was elected in 2019, I promised my constituents we would take back control. I want this legislation to be as strong as possible, and therefore I will be supporting the generic cash amendments." Colleagues of theirs, "These are arguments I have consistently made and will continue to make." #Rwanda. Lee Anderson, another deputy chair of the party, shorter, "The Rwanda bill, I have signed the cash and generic amendments. I will vote for them." And then former Prime Minister Boris Johnson's waded in this morning. Governments around the world are now trying to imitate the UK-Rwanda policy for tackling illegal people trafficking. "This bill must be as legally robust as possible, and the right course is to adopt the amendments." Well, let's talk to Ian Watson, BBC's political correspondent. How tricky is this for Rishi Sunak and the government, Ian?
It is tricky because the senior Conservative strategist, Isaac Levido, last night had a meeting of Conservative MPs, and he told them very bluntly, divided parties fail. And over the next 48 hours, we're going to see lots of Conservative divisions in the House of Commons, divisions in the true sense, parliamentary sense of the word, in the sense that we'll actually vote on amendments where you may have perhaps 60 or more Conservative MPs voting against the Prime Minister. Now, it's entirely up to the Speaker, or I think in this case the Deputy Speaker, to decide which amendments, which proposed changes to the bill are going to be discussed and debated. But it seems highly likely that one amendment from Sir Bill Cash, the veteran Eurosceptic, effectively saying that the government can ignore anything that comes out of the European Court of Human Rights in relation to deportations in Rwanda, and indeed international law more widely, and another from the former Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, which in effect would tighten even further the grounds for anyone trying to launch a legal challenge against deportation. It's highly likely those will be taken. Liz Truss is one of the signatories, former Prime Minister, of course. You've mentioned Brendan Clark-Smith and Lee Anderson, 2 Conservative Vice Chairmen. They're also going to be supporting this as well. So I think those divisions are going to be there. Very difficult for Rishi Sunak politically to manage. But what I'm hearing from Downing Street is that they think they're confident they can get this bill through. They don't think these amendments are legally robust. In other words, they might actually lead to more legal challenges rather than fewer.
Right.
So it looks likely that they will not accept those amendments.
Might this persuade some of the rebel Conservative MPs? If we just show our viewers and guests these headlines. In the Times, Sunak to draft 150 judges to fast-track Rwanda migrant appeals. We hear there's a written ministerial statement gone through to that effect. And also, we already knew that the Prime Minister set to ignore European judges blocking Rwanda plan. Allies expect PM to disregard further attempts by the European Court on Human Rights to ground deportation flights. Will that persuade others to row in behind the government?
Yeah, well, let's deal with those bit by bit. So the first thing that you mentioned, obviously, is this idea of the European Court of Human Rights grounding flights at the last minute. Rishi Sunak has already said that ministers can ignore that in future, and that hasn't been enough to persuade rebel MPs. So there is, amongst this welter of amendments, there's one that effectively says that the default position that should be, not just in the ministerial discretion, the default position should be to ignore any such intervention by the European Court of Human Rights. So, therefore, no, that hasn't persuaded the rebels. On the other matter, in the past hour, the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, has issued a written ministerial statement, and yes, he is increasing vastly the capacity of the judiciary to deal with immigration appeals. So, for example, 5,000 more sitting days, new judges to be appointed, 100 more support staff, 25 more rooms being made available in which they can hear these appeals. So this is basically targeted at those MPs that say, look, all these appeals are simply going to clog up the system. You'll never get people on flights to Rwanda. They'll use the judiciary to stop all this happening. And he's saying, no, actually, in fact, we'll do this very, very quickly. We can get people on those planes.
Ian Watson, thank you very much. Rachel, you're also a deputy chair of the Conservative Party. Should your colleagues Brendan Clark-Smith and Lee Anderson be sacked for voting, saying they're going to vote against the government?
Well, clearly, these are matters for the whips, not for me. But we all start from a position of wanting this bill to be as strong as possible, and I share that just as Lee and Brendan do. I mean, clearly there is a collective responsibility issue, but what our constituents want is for this bill to actually do the job. I think it's important to say that this is an effective deterrent, and we have a plan to tackle this, whereas what I'm afraid to say the Labour Party, I'm sure you'll come to bed.
I will.
They have absolutely no plan, and they've been clear that they are going to cancel this whole plan should they ever get into government.
But before we get
by the way, I don't think this is a foregone conclusion. I know people like to say this, but we are determined to crack down on this. It's one of the key pledges that Rishi Sunak has actually already delivered on. We've already seen these crossings fall by quite significant numbers because of the actions that we've taken, which Labour have opposed.
All right, but let's just focus
every single
But
step.
let's just focus on what's going on within the Conservative Party, because that obviously is critically important to Rishi Sunak and this bill, which, as you have said, it's central to the government's agenda. I mean, as a deputy chair, would you expect to be sacked if you voted against the government?
Yes.
Right. So, in other words, they should be sacked.
So there are discussions going on, as your colleague has already said, and rightly so, because there's a lot in this. It's illegally complex. It's involving interpretations of novel and new law. It's a very tough piece of legislation already. So I very much hope that everybody will come to the place where they feel that they can back this bill because it is an incredibly effective deterrent. We need a deterrent to deter these illegal crossings and the loss of life in the channel.
I must just allow Ben to respond to what you said about Labour not having a plan.
Go after the gangs. Double the number of return officers. The returns have fallen by 50%. Make proper deals with our European partners to deal with it. This has cost £400 million for not a single asylum seeker. There are more Home Office ministers have gone to Rwanda than asylum seekers. It won't work. It hasn't worked. It's not going to work. We've had two bills trying to do exactly the same thing in the last year. One of them hasn't been implemented. The other one has failed. So this is all about who wants to lead the Conservative Party after the next election. A sensible immigration and asylum policy is being held ransom by a Tory party leadership contest, which should happen after the election, not now, because nothing else is being done in this country. Britain isn't working. We need a government to focus on the things that people actually care about and have sensible policies that work.
briefly respond.
If I may, it's not the case to say that the previous legislation hasn't worked. We have got those crossings to Albania down by a third, and we've also, because of the work that we've got with France, we've prevented huge numbers of crossings that have taken place, and that would all be put at risk by a Labour government.
Well, let's talk to the leader of Reform UK, Richard Tice. Richard, you're opposed to the government's Rwanda plan. What's your plan?
Look, the whole thing is a complete dead cat.
Right.
It's not a deterrent, and we know that because the crossings have already started this year, and tragically, this weekend, 5 people have lost their lives because of this government's utter failure.
So what's your plan? What's your plan?
Stop. It's very clear. You've got to do what Australia did. We've got to pick people up safely out of the dinghies, put them into the border force cutters, and take them back to France, which we are legally entitled to do under 2 international treaties.
All right, let me get Rachel's response.
Hear me out.
Let me get Rachel's response.
Until the Prime Minister has the guts to do this, this will not stop, and people will keep dying, and the blood is on the hands of the politicians who fail to do what needs to be done. It's disgraceful.
Well, lots of accusations there. Rachel, what's wrong with the Australia plan?
I'm afraid that's very emotive language, and it doesn't deal with the core issue of the substantive issue, which is we need a deterrent. This is a tough deterrent, which, by the way, is modelled on a lot of the best practice around the world. Of course, we are not going to be breaking vast amounts of international law. Nobody would expect us as a Conservative Party to do that. But nevertheless, this goes much, much further than any previous legislation. We need the deterrent. We know for a fact that the gangs are very worried about this deterrent coming in. So we need to pass it. And by the way, we've got Labour here who would overturn it and reverse it if they ever got anywhere near government, as they have done. They voted against every single measure that we have brought in, which has already seen crossings fall. And I think Reform have not come forward with anything significant apart from a lot of emotional language, which I think is completely wrong when we are talking about the loss of, when we're talking about the loss of life.
Rachel, have
in the
you
Channel,
read the international treaties?
We are talking about people dying in the Channel.
Yeah, because,
and that's
because
what we're
you haven't
talking
got the
about.
guts to send them back. That's
and
why
we have to have a serious plan which deals with all aspects of it. It's not just about sort of this emotive conflict here. It's about what will work and what will actually work to deter putting people in the gangs in the first place.
Well, let Richard respond. Let Richard respond. When you say send them back, though, what do you mean? Send them back where?
We're legally entitled to pick these people up out of the boats and take them back to France. Take them back to Dunkirk.
Take them back to
back
France.
to Calais. Yes, that's exactly what I said. We're entitled to do it under the international treaties that I'm absolutely certain Rachel hasn't read. And she talks about emotive. There's nothing more emotive than failing to stop this and people dying on the English Channel, Rachel. Get a grip.
Rachel?
Look, of course I've read the treaties, thank you. I do my job, I take it very seriously. As anybody who's elected to Parliament to represent their constituents who take this issue very seriously. You take people back to France, they're just going to try and cross again. We have to have a long-term, sustainable issue. We have got returns agreements in place. This government is a government that has put in returns agreement and has seen those crossings fall because of the actions that we're taking. We need to go further. That's why we need to have this Rwanda bill in place. And by the way, you know, the Labour Party obviously are going to put all of that at risk, as they've already done by voting against everything that we set forward. It would take us back to square one.
That's fine. You've made that clear. Let me go back to Richard. When you say you would safely pick these people up, how would you do that in the middle of the Channel?
In the same way that they safely pick them up at the moment and bring them to Dover. It's exactly the same process of picking them out of the boat.
So you're going to use the border force. You're going to use the border force. You're going to tow these dinghies. You're going to get on these dinghies. What are you going to do?
Currently, they're picked out of the dinghies and they're safely brought in the border force cutters to Dover. We just change direction and take them back to Dunkirk and Calais. It's not rocket science.
Right. What do you make of that plan, Ollie?
I think none of the political solutions we just heard have any basis in practicality or compassion. There's a lot of emotive appeals to what about these people who are dying in the Channel? If we cared that much about the people that were dying in the Channel, we put a processing centre in France. No one wants to do that. It was offered by the French. We declined the opportunity to do so. Why do we decline the opportunity to do so? Because it would make it easier and safer for these people to cross the Channel. It serves a political purpose to demonise them, to have the adjectives being used here, right? Tough, strong, as if these people are some kind of a threat to us. They are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. They are prepared to risk life and limb to try and get to this country. And frankly, the idea that there's some kind of threat to us that needs to be sent back to France or that we need to deter coming here is morally offensive.
They're dying in the English Channel, man.
That's because there are no safe routes. Ollie's just made the point.
Rubbish.
There aren't safe
Absolute
routes.
Rubbish.
The government
The
keeps
Belgian
saying it's going to
authorities-
introduce safe routes.
You do
It
not
hasn't
know what you're
introduced
talking
safe
about.
routes.
Hang on, Richard. In terms of safe and legal routes, there are some safe and legal routes, as we know, but they don't extend to the countries where many asylum seekers are coming from, do they? Richard?
Are you talking to me or someone in the panel?
No, Richard, that's you.
Look, yes, there are some safe and legal routes, but the reality is the kind and compassionate thing to do is to stop people dying on the English Channel and then do the same in the Mediterranean. You do that by stopping the business model. The Belgian authorities, when people were leaving Belgium coming to the UK, they picked them up and took them back to Belgium. And guess what? The boats stopped coming from Belgium. It works. It's the only thing that will stop the boats. There's no one in Parliament, there's no one in this government, including the Prime Minister, who's got the guts that needs to be done in order to stop people dying.
Rachel,
it's
can
disgraceful.
I ask about two of the things that Ollie mentioned? One, a processing centre in France, and why that wasn't deemed a reasonable option, first of all. Do you think it would be reasonable to have?
I just don't think it's practical and workable because, for a start, where do you draw the line? This is not about, just to be clear, this is not about demonising people. Of course, people want to come to our country. It's a great country, but there are limits, and that's what the Brexit vote was for. People voted to take back control of our borders and have control of immigration, both legal and illegal. We have to deal with this upstream. We do have, we have taken measures with the smuggling gangs, and we've mounted those prosecutions. We've smashed those. We need to keep doing that, but it's part of the holistic plan. So no, the processing centre in France is not a realistic solution. It would be overwhelmed very quickly, as you can see, because there are hundreds of millions of people from around the world who would love to come to this country.
What about the problems within the Conservative Party? Kate, how serious is this, do you think?
Which ones?
On this issue?
Look, the question this week is not really about the Rwanda bill. It's about when the Tories want to have an election. Because if they were to seriously shoot down this Rwanda bill and they were looking at an election right now, I think the polls suggest the consequences of that, whereas I think at least there's, some limited hope that if you can push this for months, perhaps those polls start to change. And I think the government has to, and senior cabinet ministers have to really reflect on how they've got here with their Tory party, that we are in a position where the Conservative Party of the United Kingdom is fighting about whether or not it needs to be more robust and harsher and more cruel towards some of the most vulnerable people on this earth who have come to the UK experiencing things we can't imagine, to then put genuine refugees on the same plane with economic migrants, take them to Rwanda and say you can never have a path to return, is truly heartless. And, I could be wrong, I'm speculating here, but I look at past principles and policies from Rishi Sunak, from Jeremy Hunt, from James Cleverly. These are pretty classically liberal men. How has their Tory party ended up fighting over whether or not we need to crack down on this further? And there's, of course, a reason why Rishi Sunak is pushing against these amendments at the moment. It's because the Rwandan government has said this is taking it too far. We don't want to break international law. But I also wonder if perhaps in their hearts they know that something's gone terribly wrong, that this is how we're going into the election. And I would just say to Labour and Reform as well, you're playing the game. We are going into an election year where who can be toughest and most heartless on immigration is going to be a key policy. We have a stagnant economy. We need 1 million homes built yesterday, and yet this is going to be the issue. I wouldn't be surprised if voters listening to this debate right now felt quite disheartened at the state of it.
We oppose the Rwanda bill we have all along, and I think when you look at our manifesto and our policies on this, you won't repeat that closer to the election. Labour recognises that our economy needs migrants. We need people to come here. Our labour market is so tight. So many sectors in the country
Your leader has been very robust about taking down headline figures and ignoring a lot of that economic data, frankly.
We've always said that we will have an immigration and asylum system that is fit for our economic needs.
Well, let me just put that to Richard, because you've been shaking your head during that last bit, Richard. I mean, you told Nick Ferrari on LBC quite recently that Reform UK welcome legal, lawful migration as long as it's good for the economy. Is that true?
That's right. We would have a smart. We'd have a smart immigration policy where you welcome one in, one out. About 450,000 people as a long-term average emigrate every year, so we could welcome those. But they need to be highly skilled, so they genuinely add value where we've got skill shortages until we train our own people.
Well,
Hang on a second.
Hang on.
We've got a record population and we've got a record number of people on out-of-work benefits. Let's train our own as opposed to big business relying on the cheap overseas labour like they rely on, like being addicted to cocaine, for heaven's sake.
contradictory. Yeah, but they're two contradictory statements, or they seem that way to me. Are you in favour of zero net migration, so naught, or are you in favour of migration? Hang on. Or are you in favour of migration that is good for the economy?
I'm in favour of smart immigration up to a limit of equal to the number of people who emigrate every year. So you've got one in, one out. Right. That's net zero. It's, by the way, the only net zero we do want in this economy.
Oh, right. Well, add that in as well. But I think a lot of people will think, well, what's good? Who's judging what's good for the economy here? What's good for the economy in your mind, then?
What's good for the economy is where we've got genuine skill shortages of high-wage jobs, which should broadly be above the national average. Instead, what we've had is big business being addicted to cheap, low-skilled overseas labour, well below the average salary, and that's depressed British wages, and sadly it's meant that too many people are trapped on out-of-work benefits.
All right, what do you make of that economics analysis?
Well, Richard, I'd like to ask you, there are about 900,000 job vacancies in the UK right now, and actually as we came out of the pandemic, particularly in 2021, 2022, we saw some of those traditionally classified lower skilled jobs receive huge wage bumps in a bid to get people back into work. It very often didn't work. And my question to you is, if you were going for zero net migration, are you suggesting that you will take that real hit to the economy, potentially for years on end, in a bid to try to get more native Brits back into work? Right. But let's be honest about the trade-off here, because
hang on, Richard. Let her finish her point, and then you can respond.
I just want to be honest about the trade-offs here, because when we talk about zero net migration and we look at the job vacancies and we look at the needs in the UK, you have to be very clear about which workers you don't want here and what the economic impact and social impact will be. Care workers, healthcare workers, they might not pass your smart immigration policy, and goodness knows we'll miss them.
For an economy to work, as you well know, or should know, you have to have some job vacancies. You have to have people
not
on
nearly
the move.
a million.
Hang on, that's about a long-term average. You need that. And here's the thing, if you've got hang on, as you well know, if you've got a shortage of labour, what happens? Wages go up. That's good for British people. And if the businesses can't afford the wages, they invest in capital equipment to replace it. That's how an economy works.
As just mentioned, we have seen a lot of those processes. We are still struggling to find the workers.
You want to welcome infinite supply of cheap, low-skilled overseas labour that depresses British wages,
Richard,
and that's shocking.
Richard, that's not my end goal here.
That's exactly what you're suggesting.
What I'm suggesting is that when people, you know, on my side of the argument, which is certainly more classically liberal in immigration, we have to admit, right, that things like housing, things like healthcare, things that the state supply tend to be in short supply when you have more people come in unprecedented levels. Of course they do. What your side of the argument needs to grapple with is who don't you want here to fill in those job vacancies? We have a shortage of care home workers. We have a shortage of healthcare workers. We have a 7.6 million waiting list on NHS England alone. Who isn't coming here, and what is the impact on the economy going to be? It is not straightforward in either direction. This is a nuanced debate.
Are you aware that we've got over 5 million people on out-of-work benefits?
Yes, but they're not all trained doctors, Richard.
Why don't we train up our own people? Why don't we allow...
We should. That may take decades.
Why don't we increase the starting point for income tax to £20,000 a year as opposed to $12,500?
So you won't say. So you make these grand proclamations about immigration, but fundamentally you will not say who you wouldn't have be here. And I think, again, a lot of people are listening and thinking where are the gaps going to be and how is that going to hurt?
We're going to have to stop here very briefly, Richard.
You're welcome 450,000 as a long-term average. You're completely misreading the economic reality, Kate.
All right, Richard Tice from Reform UK, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about renting. You heard Ollie Dugmore, our guest, there in the headlines, talking about landlordism. Let's listen to a little bit more.
Landlordism, it's the redistribution of income, but in completely the wrong direction, if that makes sense. It is the transfer of wealth from the wage class to the asset class. It is the people who own housing extracting a rent. I mean, obviously, we all know this is called rent, from people who can't. And because of the way that the property market in Britain functions, that also serves to deny those people in the wage class access to owning the thing that the landlord has.
Rachel, what do you make of that as former housing minister?
So obviously I didn't see the whole kind of thesis that you were setting out, but you will probably know, and I know that you do know, we are taking very tough action against exploitative landlords, and also taking on planning and we're also taking on freeholders. I've literally just come from the leasehold and freehold bill in the House of Commons today, where we are enacting sweeping reforms to restore true home ownership to millions of people who are trapped in this feudal leasehold system. So I think I'd have to sort of study what you said. I recognise some of it, but we are taking a lot of action, because what we ultimately want is, if people are either renting or buying their own home, we want them to be able to do that in a fair way at a fair price.
Ollie?
Renters reform bill, I think, first sort of muted, particularly in terms of no-fault evictions. We're talking 2019, it's 2024 now. The rental crisis, the housing crisis more broadly, is a moral, political and social problem, the scale of which I think very few people are prepared to engage with. We have fundamentally broken one of the key aspects of the social contract in this country, which is the idea that if you work hard and try to get on, you should be able to buy a home. Housing is more expensive right now, it's at the same level, since 1876, about 8 times average earnings, the price of an average house. That was before the invention of the motor car. Queen Victoria was on the throne, and property was the preserve of a wealthy elite. We haven't fully understood the consequences psychologically, economically, in terms of health of younger people, instead of starting their own homes, starting families, and instead living in insecure, often low-quality housing. It is a moral stain on our country.
Well, you made it very clear, and you weren't very flattering about landlords or the system that exists in that podcast. But on the other hand, Rachel, you weren't exactly flattering at the Tory party conference, the last one, when you were housing minister, about tenants. This is the headline, but if I read you the whole excerpt, there are plenty of young people who are in the private rented sector who are not weed-smoking bad people in gangs and crack dens and everything else and smashing up the neighbourhood. There are lots of decent people, hard-working people in the private rented sector, and we need to do the right thing for them. I mean, your characterisation isn't terribly flattering broadly of people who rent.
I don't think that's true, if you read the whole thing.
Well, I did read the whole thing. I mean, you say there are some or plenty of young people who are not weed-smoking bad people in gangs and crack dens.
That's right.
But are you saying there are lots who are?
Well, Jo, obviously this is a whole problem of things being taken out of context. I was in a think tank event. I'm sure everybody in this room has been to a think tank event. And there are a lot of people in that room who are criticising the Renters Reform Bill from the perspective of being a landlord. And as Housing Minister, I dealt with that on multiple occasions. People were casting allegations and aspersions and saying that all tenants are bad and they're all smashing up properties and they're all causing problems. And what I was doing there was putting the other side of the argument. And as I said, not all tenants are bad people. They are decent people, they are working. There are more and more people now in the private rented sector with children, with families, which is why we are bringing in this legislation.
What did you make of the characterisation?
It's generous, very generous, that not all people who live in rented accommodation smoke weed and are in gangs. More people right now are in rented accommodation than have been since the millennium. Composes about 20% of our housing stock. That number needs to come way down. It should be a result of an extensive programme of council house building. I don't say there's no place for...
I was going to say, you seem to be against, both of you sort of seem to be against the idea, or that it's second rate, of renting.
I'm not against it.
In certain circumstances, provision of rented housing is appropriate for people who maybe move often for work. There are instances where it's suitable, but it certainly shouldn't compose the significant chunk that it does at the moment in our
Can we have a nice political moment here? Because I actually think, Rachel, I'm familiar with your work when you were housing minister, and I actually think there's probably a lot of agreement on this panel when it comes to housing. I know that you correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth in any way here, but you understood that the chronic housing shortage is primarily responsible for this, and that we need, as I said before, 1 million homes yesterday. And, we can debate, and we should debate specifically the rights that tenants deserve, but I think we all understand that the crisis that is the housing market, and it's not a market, it's really a cartel, is the fundamental problem here. Renting in and of itself is not bad. In fact, it gives you a lot of flexibility when you don't quite know where you want to settle down and you're saving up your deposit. The problem at the moment is that young people, and by young I mean people who are even 45, are not in a position to save a deposit. We are not in a position to get on the housing ladder, a lot of young people. It is an incredibly difficult situation, and we need more homes.
Right. I mean, Labour's talked a lot about affordable housing, getting tough on developers, but what is your policy to help renters?
Well, I think we need to look at the whole way that the private rented market is regulated. I mean, it's nothing wrong with being in a private rented sector on the continent. In some cases, the majority of people, but they have much stronger protections. It's very disappointing that the government has delayed yet again banning no-fault evictions.
Is that something that a Labour government would do immediately?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Is it? OK.
And, we need to regulate the private rented market better, but we need to build, which is exactly what Keir Starmer said at party conference. We need to reform our planning system, and we need to bring back the targets that Rishi Sunak very irresponsibly scrapped for local authorities, which basically lets local authorities off the hook when it comes to providing new housing.
Are you disappointed that no-fault evictions have happened? The bill hasn't gone through?
Well, it's progressing through the House. It's already been through committee stage, and I'm sure it'll come back as soon as parliamentary time allows. We've come a long way from where we were, certainly when I was in the role, and I'm absolutely confident it will become part of our legal settlement, which is the right thing to do.
Because the costs of housing, as we've heard from this side of the studio floor, are huge for young people. The cost of housing eating up anything from over half of an average income to up to 80% in some parts of the country. I mean, that's not sustainable, is it?
No, so absolutely. And where I do agree, obviously, with Kate and some of the others, is that we just need to build more houses. I've always been on that side of the argument, and I just do want to bust a myth that's slightly crept into the narrative, which we just heard from Ben, which is that we've dropped housing targets. We haven't, and we're going to build.
You have dropped legally binding, haven't you? Mandating targets on local authorities.
They were never legally binding. So we will build 1 million homes in this Parliament, which is our manifesto commitment. We've actually had high rates of house building, certainly compared to when Labour left office and crashed the economy.
All right.
And it took us a long time to get over that. People do need to remember that. We've turned this house building sector around. It needs to go a lot further. But when you talk about planning reforms, I can tell you who was beating a path to my door, opposing planning. It was Labour MPs all over the country who didn't want planning and houses built in their own constituencies.
Well, they'll come to that, of course, if they win the election. Ollie?
Both Labour and the Tories' housing commitments fall woefully short of what we require in this country. The Centre for Cities estimates that since the post-war period, the UK has had a 4.4 million shortfall in house building when compared to our European counterparts. For us to match that or even just make up for it, we'd have to build 440,000 in every year for 25 years. If you want to do it in 10 years, we'd have to build 660,000 every year. Neither of them are coming forward with policy proposals that are anywhere near match the scale of this problem.
If I can come back on that, you're making that argument, but you never actually address the issue of migration. So earlier we were discussing migration. You're very happy to have unlimited migration, both legal and illegal. Of course, those migrants have to have somewhere to live. They don't bring a house with them. Even if they're coming to work in the care sector, they are in a house that the state has provided. So I agree we need to build more houses, but you also have to address the other side of the argument, which
Rachel,
is the demand
side. If you didn't have those people coming to do these necessary jobs in so many circumstances, you would have to, again, be in a position where who in the UK is going to be doing those jobs, and the people in the UK want the homes too. My frustration with this immigration argument is, let's say you did get net migration down to 0 tomorrow, you still have a chronic housing shortage for native Brits who are in no position to get on the housing ladder.
But it's been made worse by the migration.
It is not by any means in the top.
All right, we've gone full circle. Let's talk about Brexit, because we haven't talked about that for at least 5 minutes. It's been nearly 4 years since the UK left the European Union, and at the time, Boris Johnson released a video from Downing Street, you may remember, to mark the occasion. We heard a bit of it in the headlines. Let's hear a bit more. No. Or maybe not, but you might remember it from the headlines. Ben, 4 years on, has Brexit been a success?
I don't think it's been a success, no, and not on any measure. And, I mean, Rachel will probably try to claim it has been, but if you listen to all the independent economists, we're poorer, trade is more difficult, travel is more difficult, it's more difficult for young people to fulfil their ambitions and go and work and study on the continent and vice versa. All sorts of ways it could be improved, and I look forward to the next Labour government doing it.
Well, we have Boris Johnson now, so let's just remind us what he said.
The most important thing to say tonight is that this is not an end, but a beginning. This is the moment when the dawn breaks and the curtain goes up on a new act in our great national drama. And yes, it's partly about using these new powers, this recaptured sovereignty, to deliver the changes people voted for, whether that is by controlling immigration or creating free ports or liberating our fishing industry or doing free trade deals or simply making our laws and rules for the benefit of the people of this country.
Has it been a success on those metrics?
Yes, of course it has. Many of those things have all been brought in. It's not surprising to hear sort of Ben kind of like, you know, criticising and trying to interject, because obviously Labour always stood in the way of the popular will of the British people, tried to overturn the referendum many, many times. Keir Starmer did himself. He wanted a second referendum. Obviously Ben was, I'm sure, was one of the people who had supported that idea. But we have implemented Brexit. Look, I've only got like 2 seconds. I would need several hours.
I'll give you more than 2 seconds. All right, name me one. Name me one of the successes.
Trade deals, free ports, removal of tampon tax, Solvency II, the vaccine.
Far less to our economy than the trade we've lost to the European Union.
This is not the understanding of trade deals. They come on stream over a period of time. That's a fundamental misreading of how trade deals act in the economy. Sovereignty, you can't put a price on executing the will of the British people, respecting their will. We saw how shocking it was when the elites and Parliament tried to overturn the will of the people expressed at the ballot box.
All right, well, Kate, Spectator supported Brexit. Have we made the most of it?
Certainly not, but the opportunity is there. And I think that's what Boris Johnson's speech back in 2020 really did highlight, that this is something that can go very well. It can be a success if politicians have the will to do it. The UK left the European Union. 8 weeks later, we were in lockdown. We had 2 years of a pandemic. I would argue there hasn't been a lot of time. By the way, that's not an excuse. Politicians can always do better. But, you know, if you challenge me to say, have we seen the benefits of Brexit in the past few years, there are a few things that jump to mind. I know that the UK could have gone its own way on its vaccine rollout and procurement. I don't think it would have, given what we actually saw happen in the Eurozone around that. And when the EU showed its real hand and started to threaten to not send the vaccines over our way, I think we discovered what kind of club the UK was in, and it was quite good to be out of it. I'm not sure the UK would have been as bold on Ukraine. I think there are a lot of areas where being truly independent, we can already see the success of that. The trade deals are also great. There needs to be so much more. To simply say it's a success suggests that it's done. This really is the beginning. And, you know, voters who voted for Remain or Brexit deserve to see their politicians make the most of it.
Ollie?
I guess it depends against the metric we measure it. If we go back to the campaign and we say, is it to take control of our money, our borders and our laws? Certainly on the laws case, yes, absolutely. I'd say that we have sovereignty now here in the UK. In terms of our borders, you know, legal immigration is at a record high, 750,000. I think some voters are slightly disappointed to discover that what control of our borders actually entails. In terms of our money, I think most people, politicians, economists and the general public would bite your hand off for the 4% of GDP that we're forecast to have if we'd have stayed in the EU right now. So, yeah, a mixed bag.
Right. I mean, if I just show you this tweet from the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, Brexit has resulted in, he says, Londoners being nearly £3,500 worse off, 290,000 fewer jobs in London in 2023, and the London economy being £30 billion smaller than it would have been. Is he right?
Yeah, London's been particularly badly affected, but so has the fishing industry and so has the farming industry, all those industries that were supposed to be benefiting from Brexit, and that's part of the 4% that Ollie's just referred to that's gone off our GDP as a result of Brexit.
That report, which I think says that we're going to be 300 billion worse off by 2035, has been torn apart by Remain economists as well as those who supported Leave. The New Statesman did a very nice write-up on this. The assumptions made behind those figures are not assumptions that anybody else would put on this.
But the OBR and the Bank of England have been quite clear about how
on a different scale. Assume that the UK would be getting growth that's better than the Eurozone, that's better than the USA by a long way. Nobody thinks that's true, given the conditions of the pandemic, of course.
Are you disappointed by the fact that the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, doesn't think rejoining the single market, the EU single market, would boost economic growth?
No, because it's not a political reality. I think what Labour needs to do...
He actually says it wouldn't boost our economic growth.
I think it's not a political reality, so there's no point going there before an election. What I hope Labour will do if we win the election is to remove some of the unnecessary barriers that Johnson's disastrous Brexit deal has put in the way of trade with our biggest trading partner, deal with some of the other things, the ridiculous system whereby we've lost all these school passes coming from Europe to our language schools because of the new visa requirements for school recruits, all those sorts of things. He needs to show how a closer relationship with Europe can benefit our economy, and then I think you open up a debate for a closer relationship, but not for a very long time. I also think if we have a Trump presidency, that could completely change the dynamic in this country about our position in the world, because it's going to be a very lonely place for Britain on our own if President Trump becomes President of the United States.
Well, on that note, that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. That's it, but I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live and Prime Minister's Questions at 11:15 here on BBC Two and the iPlayer. It promises to be very interesting as the Rwanda bill goes through Parliament. Bye-bye.